Hi, my name is Nathan, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about Japanese American internment. Imagine being born a US citizen and forced to live in concentration camps. Well, in the mid-1900s, this is how many people were treated. Many people in the US are still unaware that concentration camps were even held in the US. We have family relatives that were held in these camps and still don't truly know the depth of their suffering inside of them. I'm connected to the topic because both my great-grandparents, who were second-generation US citizens, were held in these camps. I've gained knowledge about Japanese hardship through a group of credible sources. Japanese Americans were wrongfully forced into concentration camps. First, I'm going to talk about how the government forced Japanese Americans into these camps. Then I'm going to talk about the treatment of them inside these camps. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the suffering of them getting out of these camps and returning home. Many Japanese Americans were innocent. An article titled Japanese Internment Camps on History.com writes, the military assigned tag ID numbers to families, including the children. The president issued an executive order. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9006. This sanctioned the removal of Japanese immigrants and Americans of Japanese heritage from their homes to be imprisoned in camps throughout the country. They were also disliked by their country. An article titled 12 Facts About Japanese Internment in the U.S., Scott Beggs wrote that Colonel Carl Beniston avowed that anyone with even one drop of Japanese blood should be incarcerated. The country generally went along with that statement. White farmers and landowners on the West Coast had great economic incentive to get rid of their Japanese neighbors who had come to the area only decades before and found great success with new irrigation methods. Next, I will talk about the treatment of the Japanese Americans inside of the camps. They were treated like animals. Before getting on buses to be transported, internees stayed in stalls where livestock had been kept recently. The smell of manure rose up, dust blew inside, and people were forced to literally live like animals. They lived in unhealthy living conditions. In an article titled 10 Shameful Facts About Japanese American Internment, Shannon M. Harris wrote that many of these units didn't have roofs overhead. Healthcare, food, and general cleanliness were disgustingly low. Numerous people died or experienced great suffering due to lack of medical treatment. They were treated like prisoners. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and over 1,000 incarcerated Japanese Americans were sent overseas to do seasonal work. In this image, you can see the barbed wire and the Japanese Americans inside the camp. And in this image, you can see some of the Japanese Americans who were sent overseas to do seasonal work. Lastly, Japanese Americans weren't just treated badly while inside the camps. They were treated badly as they were closing and returning home. How the government relocated Japanese Americans. After World War II ended, the internment camps closed. 4,724 Japanese Americans were permanently relocated to Japan. President Gerald Ford officially repealed Executive Order 9066 in 1967, and in 1988, Congress issued a formal apology and passed the Civil Liberties Act, awarding $20,000 each to over 80,000 Japanese Americans. Camps also affected the mental and physical health of Japanese Americans. There have been multiple studies on physical and psychological health of former internees. They found that those placed in camps had a greater risk for cardiovascular disease, death, as well as trauma from stress. Younger internees experienced low self-esteem as well as psychological trauma that led many to shed their Japanese culture as well as their language. After returning, many Japanese Americans were met with racial discrimination. Former internees who returned for their assets were beat and even sometimes killed. Neighborhood signs declare that Japs weren't welcome home anymore. Not only did they lose their belongings, but they also lost their sense of belongings. They weren't even welcome to rebuild the lives they once knew before. In this image, you can see one of the many signs that were unwelcoming as the Japanese Americans returned home. In conclusion, Japanese Americans were stuck in these camps where they were treated horribly and had to suffer racial discrimination after returning home. Through my research, I found that Japanese Americans suffered much more than I originally thought, even though they were innocent.